immediately after meeting, Karla and Paul became sexually obsessed with each other. Unlike the other girls he had been with, Karla actually encouraged his perverse sexual behavior. According to Invisible Darkness by Stephen Williams, Karla would beg for Paul while handcuffed. He would even ask her what she thought of him being a rapist. She stated she thought it would be cool. So he then started his raping career. Between 1987 and 1990, Paul started committing increasingly vicious serial rapes in and around Scarborough. Most of the victims he attacked, he had stalked as they got off buses late at night. In 1987, Paul Bernardo became known as the Scarborough Rapist. The pattern was almost always the same. He would stalk the victim as they got off the bus late at night. He would grab the woman from behind and pull her to the ground. He would talk to her the entire time as he forced anal sex and fellatio on the victim. He would then let them go. By 1989, the number of sexual assaults climbed to 11. Authorities were at a loss as to who could have been doing this, but they were able to collect a lot of physical evidence to help determine if they had the right suspect. Police felt they also had a good composite sketch of the culprit. While authorities had this sketch in their possession, they only shared it with other officers in the region. They did not share it with the public for a long time. The entire time this was happening, Karla knew every detail. She knew what Paul was doing and actively encouraged it. One of the victims told authorities that she remembered seeing a woman with the rapist who had a video camera in her hand. But authorities discredited her statement, chalking it up to hysteria. His first known or reported rape from this time was on May 4th, 1987, when he followed a 21-year-old woman home, attacking her in front of her parents' house. Just 10 days later, his next victim would be a 19-year-old woman whom he attacked in her parents' backyard. The list of attacks continues with failed attempts almost being caught, but unfortunately, most of these attacks were successful, with some of the girls being as young as 15. Detective Constable Steve Irwin of Toronto's Metropolitan Police was deeply involved in the Scarborough rapist case. The victims had a lot of similarities in their stories, so authorities were certain they were dealing with one man committing these crimes. All the victims described a well-groomed young man who had good teeth and did not smell bad. They stated he talked the whole time he was assaulting them and wanted to hear specific things. Just before Christmas in 1987, a victim was able to give a better description of the man, stating that he was good-looking, about 6 feet tall, clean-shaven, and had no tattoos. The composite sketch of the attacker had the exact likeness of Paul Bernardo, but police never published the photo for the public's help. One of Paul's ex-girlfriends had also gone to authorities several times about Paul due to his brutal rape, physical abuse, and threats to cause her bodily harm. A report was filed, but nothing came of it. Some coincidences tied Paul to the Scarborough rapist, as it was reported the attacker drove a white Capri, and so did Paul. He also lived in the vicinity of where these attacks were happening, but still, no one looked at him. It wasn't until May 1990 that authorities decided to finally publish the composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist. The picture plus a reward of $150,000 caused a flood of tips to come in. By this time, Paul wasn't working at Price Waterhouse anymore. He was living entirely off of his cigarette smuggling income. However, his former colleagues saw the newspaper picture and were astonished by how much the image resembled Paul. One would eventually call authorities and report that the picture looked a lot like Paul Bernardo. However, police were swamped with similar calls and did not have the manpower to follow up on all of the tips. Detective Irwin took all the physical evidence gathered from the victims and sent it to the forensic laboratory. From the semen samples, they were able to determine him to be in the 12.8% of the male population. By this time, many of Paul's acquaintances had contacted authorities about him. So Irwin decided to go talk to Paul Bernardo. Paul did not look like someone who would be a serial rapist, but Irwin still collected blood, saliva, and a hair sample from him during their meeting. These samples were given to the forensic lab along with 230 samples from other suspects. Of the 230 samples, 5 samples matched that of the serial rapist, and Paul was one of them. The 5 samples were resubmitted for additional testing in April 1992, but the Scarborough rapist mysteriously ended his reign. As the attacks had seemingly stopped, the case was no longer a priority, so the efforts to find the Scarborough rapist came to a standstill. Karla and Paul resided on Bayview in St. Catharines. He was completely living off of his income from smuggling cigarettes across the border, and because of this career, he needed stolen license plates as he frequently crossed the US-Canada border. Due to this need for stolen license plates, he happened across his next victim, Leigh Mahaffy. Leigh was described as a troubled 14-year-old. She was strong-willed and independent, ignored her curfew, engaged in promiscuous, skipped school, and would shoplift. Her parents would respond to her rule-breaking behavior with tough love. This was especially true on June 15, 1991. Leigh Mahaffy had been locked out of her house when she missed curfew after attending a friend's wake. At 2 a.m., Paul Bernardo was in the Burlington area to steal license plates when he noticed the teenager locked out of her home. He then left his car and approached the girl, stating that he wanted to break into one of her neighbors' houses. She didn't seem too concerned about it and asked if Paul had any cigarettes. He then led her to his car. Some reports make it seem as if she willingly went to his car, while others report that Leigh was forced to go with him to his car at knife point, where he blindfolded the 14-year-old and forced her into the car. He drove her to Port Dalhousie and informed Karla that he had a new victim. Karla was upset that Paul had used their best champagne glasses to entertain their victim. But her anger soon diminished, and she became the obedient wife Paul demanded her to be. The entire brutal attack on Leigh was videotaped. Paul gave Karla detailed instructions on how to make love to Leigh. He voiced his commands as if he were a director of a blockbuster film. I think the creepiest part is that they were listening to pop music as if they were all having an innocent party. After Karla finished her part, it was Paul's turn. He could be heard on the tape telling Leigh, "You're doing a good job, Leigh. A damn job. The next 2 hours are going to determine what I do to you. Right now, you're scoring perfect." The assault escalated with Paul sodomizing her with such force, it caused Leigh to scream in pain and beg for him to stop. Leigh stated that her blindfold was slipping, which worried her attackers, because then she could probably identify them if they let her go. So, they killed her. Who killed her, I think, is more or less still up for debate, as Paul says Karla fed her a lethal dose of the sedative she used on her sister, while Karla says Paul strangled the girl. Karla's family ate dinner at their house, while Leslie's lifeless body was in the basement. After their dinner party, Paul and Leigh got to work dismembering Leslie's body with a circular saw and encasing each part of her remains in cement. The couple made numerous trips to dump the cement blocks 11 miles away in Lake Gibson. One of the blocks weighed 200 pounds and was left lying near the shore. On June 29, 1991, a man and his wife were canoeing on Lake Gibson when they made an odd discovery. They came across a concrete block with what appeared to be animal flesh encased inside. The occurrence was so strange that the man decided to go back to the spot with the help of a fisherman and pull the concrete block out of the water to inspect it. Inside, they found the calf and foot of a young woman. Authorities rushed to the scene where they found 5 concrete blocks in total that had been dumped in the shallow water. They theorized that whoever dumped these concrete blocks was not familiar with the area, because if they had dumped the blocks over the bridge where the water was deeper, they would most likely have never been found. Leslie's distinctive braces provided the clues authorities needed to identify her. Paul started to become bored, as he had not received the entertainment he craved in a while. So Karla decided to call Jane back to her home. But she was a far cry from what Paul wanted, because she would not consent to Paul having intercourse with her. She believed she was still a virgin, not knowing what happened that night. Instead, she would only agree to oral sex. She would later tell her writing instructor about Paul, and in turn, the instructor would tell Jane's mother. This put a damper on Paul and Karla's opportunities. But still, one night, things seemingly got out of hand again with the sedative, because Jane vomited and stopped breathing for a while. This scared Paul and Karla to no end, and they even called an ambulance for her. When they were able to resuscitate her, the ambulance was called off. Paul started to become annoyed with his wife and questioned her competence with using the drug. Karla became frantic and desperate to do something to put romance back into their relationship. For a while, they had another girl willing to satisfy their needs. But eventually, this girl would move back to Youngstown, Ohio. This left the couple with that itch they couldn't scratch, fueling the tension in their marriage. A tension that was just too unbearable for Karla. Terry Anderson was a 14-year-old girl who went missing on November 30th, 1991. Her body would not be found until 6 months later in the water at Port Dalhousie. The medical examiner who performed her autopsy stated that they saw no evidence of foul play. But it would have been difficult to determine this, considering that the body was in the water for 6 months. Unfortunately, the coroner ruled Terry's death was by drowning, probably as a result of drinking beer and taking LSD. This ruling was controversial for many, especially with the finding of Leslie Mahaffy. It is still unknown whether Terry was another victim of Karla and Paul's. After school on April 16, 1992, Kristen French was walking home. Paul and Kristen were in the area searching for their next victim when they spotted the 15-year-old girl by Holy Cross Secondary School. They pulled into the parking lot of Grace Lutheran Church, where Karla got out of the vehicle with a map, pretending to need directions. When Kristen looked at the map to help, Paul attacked her from behind, forcing the girl into the front seat of the car at knife point. Karla subdued Kristen from the back seat by pulling her hair. As Kristen always took the same route home after school and failed to arrive home, her parents immediately notified authorities. The Niagara Regional Police Service assembled a team and searched Kristen's after-school route, where they found several witnesses who had seen the abduction from different locations. Kristen's shoe was also recovered from the parking lot. From the very beginning, it was understood that Kristen would have to die. She had seen their faces, could clearly identify them, and seen where they lived. But this was not something they were going to let Kristen know. She was bigger than Karla, and was quite a bit stronger than her also. Instead, they never let her know what they had planned. Kristen believed that if she cooperated with them and did everything they demanded from her, she would be able to go free. So, in an attempt to survive, she would do the most humiliating, demoralizing, and torturous requests that these sick individuals wanted from her. It was Easter weekend when Kristen was abducted, and the entire time, Paul and Karla videotaped themselves torturing and sodomizing Kristen as they forced her to drink excessive amounts of alcohol and submit to Paul. The indecency this girl was shown just became worse and worse. The more Kristen cooperated with her captors, the more sadistic Paul became. One such instance comes from videotaped evidence. Paul stated, "I'm gonna piss on you, okay? Then I'm going to shit on you." Kristen didn't move, didn't even flinch when he slapped her in the face with his penis. He continued, "Don't worry, I won't piss in your face," before standing and urinating on her. Then he squatted over her face and tried to defecate on her, but wasn't able to. He would then tell her, "You're a f***ing piece of shit, but I like you. You look good covered in piss." Kristen suffered these indignities for a day or two before Paul and Karla murdered her. Everything but her murder was caught on film. Karla claims that Paul strangled Kristen for 7 minutes while she watched. Paul said Karla beat her with a rubber mallet because she tried to escape and was strangled with a noose around her neck, which was secured to a hope chest. After Kristen died, Paul and Karla went to Easter dinner with Karla's family. Kristen French's naked body was found in a ditch in Burlington, which is about 45 minutes away, on April 30th, 1992. She was washed and her hair had been cut off. Because she was not dismembered like Leigh, authorities concluded that the murders were not connected. Authorities centered their investigation in the Niagara Falls area because Paul and Karla were living and murdering in St. Catharines. These two places are extremely close to each other, as well as very close to the border. Superintendent Vince Bevan was put in charge of the case when Leigh Mahaffy was found. Once Kristen French's body was discovered, the government formed the Green Ribbon Task Force. A base of operations and hotlines were set up just outside of St. Catharines, and forensic experts of the American FBI advised the task force. A witness who saw Kristen French's abduction told authorities she remembered seeing a struggle going on in a car at the scene. However, the witness was not familiar with various makes of cars and thought the vehicle was maybe a Camaro. So Bevan focused his efforts on tracking the ownership of all the Camaros in the region. Paul's name would resurface in this case because of the many tips officers received. 2 officers paid Paul a visit at his Bayview home, where he was very gracious and polite during their interview. He even openly admitted that he was a suspect in the Scarborough rapes because of his facial similarities to the composite sketch. The officers noted how clean-cut and good-looking Paul was. He was intelligent and cooperative, and his home was very clean and orderly. Authorities also took note that he drove a Nissan, which looked nothing like a Camaro. Still, the 2 officers tried to contact Irwin in Toronto to ask about the results of the Scarborough rapist. Irwin responded to their inquiry 8 days later, stating that Paul's blood and saliva samples had not been done. So technically he was never cleared as a suspect. Irwin then sent the task force some of the information they had. However, he did not send the interviews with friends of Paul who tipped authorities off about him, a woman's report that Paul had been stalking her, and the police reports filed by Paul's ex-girlfriend. Because Irwin neglected to send these reports, Paul was not pursued as a suspect. It would not be until February 1993 that the forensic lab in Toronto finally got around to analyzing Paul's blood samples. The tests proved conclusively that he had raped the 3 victims from which they had semen samples. Paul Bernardo was then placed under surveillance by Irwin. He then learned that Paul had just been charged with assault in St. Catharines, filed by his wife. During the summer of 1982, Paul started using Karla as a punching bag. Even though Paul demanded some pretty insane things from his wife, apparently physically abusing her was not one that she was going to tolerate. She still stayed with him even though she had 2 black eyes and serious bruises. But her parents eventually intervened in early January 1993 when they persuaded their daughter to seek refuge in the home of one of her sister Lori's friends, whose husband was a Toronto cop. The Niagara police were eventually brought in and took Karla to the hospital. This occurred before authorities had the forensic evidence to convict Paul as the Scarborough rapist. By early February, the Toronto police and the Green Ribbon Task Force wanted to interview Karla. They also wanted to fingerprint her and question her about a Mickey Mouse watch in her possession that was very similar to one belonging to Kristen French. Several Toronto detectives interviewed Karla for about 5 hours. Just by the questions authorities were asking, it wasn't hard for Karla to figure out that they pieced together the Scarborough rapes with the recent murders in St. Catharines. She became very nervous. And apparently she told her uncle that Paul was the serial rapist and that he had killed the 2 teenagers. Next, Karla got herself a really good lawyer, one that she had met while working as a veterinary assistant, named George Walker. Karla would start to paint a picture of the marriage she had with Paul, making herself seem as though she were a victim of her husband's perverse sexual desires. But George Walker would soon realize that Karla was not who she was claiming to be. He did not know exactly what her role was at the beginning of all of this, but during negotiations and some seeking immunity, this case was about to become a lot crazier. Paul was arrested on February 17th, 1993 for the rapes and murders. Karla was shocked and afraid by this, and would begin to alleviate these feelings with painkillers and alcohol. Authorities executed the search warrants for Paul and Karla's house on February 19th, and they found a lot of incriminating evidence. Among some of these items included a handwritten description of every one of the Scarborough rapes and an extensive library of books and videos on sexual deviation, pornography, and serial killers. They would also find a home video that indicated that there had been more than one of these victims in the home, showing Karla performing sexual acts with 2 other women. On May 14th, George Walker and Murray Siegel, who is a plea bargain specialist for the Attorney General, discussed the deal for Karla. She would get 12 years in prison for 2 counts of manslaughter, but the sentences would be served concurrently, and she would be eligible for parole in a little over 3 years, with good behavior. The government even agreed to contact the parole board on Karla's behalf, underscoring the importance of Karla's testimony against Paul. Meanwhile, Murray Siegel would try his best to arrange for Karla to serve out her sentence in a psychiatric hospital instead of serving in prison. Karla's trial was very short, and she waived her right to a preliminary hearing. She was arraigned on May 18th. In exchange for this leniency in her sentencing, Karla agreed to tell the truth about her involvement in the crimes and everything she knew about them. By early March, Karla checked into a psychiatric hospital for assessment where she was given heavy doses of drugs. She would insist that she be given larger doses because she was working up the nerve to write an important letter to her parents and sister. It read, "Dear Mom, Dad, and Lori, this is the hardest letter I've ever had to write, and you'll probably all hate me once you read it. I've kept this inside myself for so long, and I just can't lie to you anymore. Both Paul and I are responsible for Tammy's death. Paul was in love with her and wanted to have sex with her. He wanted me to help him. He wanted me to get sleeping pills from work to drug her with. He threatened me and physically and emotionally abused me when I refused. No words I can say can make you understand what he put me through. So stupidly, I agreed to do as he said, but something, maybe the combination of drugs and the food she ate that night, caused her to vomit. I tried so hard to save her. I am so sorry, but no words I can say can bring her back. I would gladly give my life for hers. I don't expect you to ever forgive me, for I will never forgive myself. Karla XOXO." Please continue to part 3.